There are many definitions of sustainability. Here at Sembcorp, sustainability is safeguarding the future. To us, that future is bright. We harness the power of the sun and wind, design low-carbon sustainable solutions for green urban cities, and lay the foundation for generations to come. Sustainability is innovation, challenging the norms and leading disruption. We innovate to solve complex global problems. We use our experiences to create opportunities from challenges. Sustainability is about the communities. We care for the communities and aim to improve their quality of life. We forge strong partnerships and leverage our platforms in the region to deliver sustainable solutions. Our success is founded upon the trust from the communities we serve. Sustainability is about our people. Our success is bolstered by the strength and energy of one Sembcorp team, a team that can thrive in the current and future world. Sustainability is not just a catchphrase. To us, sustainability is our business.
So, good evening to everyone in Singapore. Good afternoon, good morning to others around the world. Hello. My name is Jessie Scott, and I'm the International Director at the Thinktank specialized in energy transition, Agora Energiewende. I'm sitting in Berlin in Germany today. Welcome to everyone, and welcome to this discussion on surfing the hydrogen wave in Southeast Asia, sharing insights from Europe and Germany, and also in our panels from some of the country studies in Southeast Asia. As I think we are all aware around the world today, hydrogen has become a hot topic. Why? Because it is key to fulfilling net zero climate targets. We are going to need climate neutral, climate target compatible gases, and hydrogen produced from green electricity, renewable-based electricity, is a very important part of achieving that, so that we can have an energy system which has both green electrons and green molecules. This means that in the past 2 years, we've seen a wave of ambitious national strategies being announced around the world that are designed to stimulate and accelerate the growth of hydrogen technologies. Our first panel today will present some of those strategies from Germany, from Europe, and from a Southeast Asia perspective. And we'll identify how priorities for hydrogen are being discussed and roadmaps to implement hydrogen are being discussed. The priorities focus on the question of which are the end-use sectors and the no-regret options for early steps in terms of hydrogen, both to maximize the opportunities to use the hydrogen supply as it scales up, and to ensure that we are really targeting where we need to have hydrogen and we don't have solutions based easily on direct electrification. Linked, of course, to that is the important implications for increased renewable energy deployment to produce the hydrogen that is green, and a very important and interesting question for many countries of the possibility of hydrogen export markets. And this is particularly interesting also in the Southeast Asia region. Then in our second panel, we will focus on the hydrogen outlook in Southeast Asia, taking a long-term perspective on the role of hydrogen in delivering overall the energy transition to deep decarbonization, and looking at studies from Indonesia, Vietnam, and Thailand. The aim of our discussion today is to understand what might be the effects of this wave of interest, and interest in the very serious sense of government strategies, big investments by companies, new companies coming into the sector, what that wave might have for South Africa's long-term policy, Southeast Asia's long-term policy visions on decarbonization. I do apologize, I was on a South Africa event earlier today, and how this will impact the evolution of the energy system around Southeast Asia. The context in the background is that many Southeast Asian countries have been looking towards natural gas, methane, as a tool to displace coal-fired generation and to meet future rising demand for energy. Hydrogen is part of the answer to ensure that that is not part of the carbon budget, because ultimately, in a climate neutral trajectory, there is not space for unabated natural gas. How far can hydrogen not only solve this challenge, but also accelerate the shift from fossil fuels to renewable energy in the region? This event takes place in English language, and we will have some very interesting presentations. I would like to kindly remind all our speakers before I introduce them that they have 10 minutes each to present. And then we will have at the end of each panel approximately 20 minutes allocated for questions and answers and discussion. And we will, of course, be monitoring questions coming in on the chat function as well. So on that basis, please, I would like to start by focusing on panel one, the insights on hydrogen strategies from Germany, Europe, and Southeast Asia, and invite the first speaker to give the perspective from Germany. This is, in fact, my colleague, Dr. Matthias Deutsch, Program Leader Hydrogen at Agora Energiewende. Matthias, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jesse. Thank you very much for having me in this discussion today. When we talk about hydrogen and in our work on hydrogen at Agora, we have often come across the term, oh yes, hydrogen is for hard to abate sectors. And I think, let's say, wait a minute, that's a bit misleading. This is not about sectors per se, but it's rather at the subsectoral level, because hydrogen is really cross-cutting. And at this subsectoral level, we have often asked ourselves, so what are the applications that really need hydrogen to become climate neutral? And so we have looked at that, and what we have come up with was an idea of putting things into categories of where it's really important to have hydrogen, what we call no regret, and then two other categories, and I show that to you. Next slide. And you see that in each of the sectors in the first line, industry, transport, there are some no regret applications that we can easily see, and then there are others that are more controversial, and then there's, we think, some really bad ideas. So for the no regret part, there has been a lot of discussion on making steel, green steel, DRI steel making, using hydrogen for feedstock, like for ammonia production. In transport, it's about long-haul aviation, shipping. The power sector needs renewables back up. And then for buildings, there's one specific application that's important in certain parts of the world. It's district heating. It's not individual buildings, but district heating. And then there are so many other applications where it's more controversial, or even, we think, a bad idea to use hydrogen. Let me give you the example of low temperature heat in industry. There are better ways and more efficient ways of providing low temperature heat. And you all know this discussion from the transport sector on passenger cars. We think it's a bad idea to use precious renewable hydrogen for that application. And the same holds for low temperature heat in buildings, in individual buildings. So with this kind of idea of no regret hydrogen applications in mind, we've also thought about how can hydrogen get to those no regret applications. And one of the answers, and we have published a study on this, is that, well, we'll need policy support instruments, because for a considerable time, renewable hydrogen will be more expensive than fossil-based hydrogen, and therefore need policy support. Let's go to the next slide, please, and then you'll see. So on the y-axis, you see kind of the cost of hydrogen. It's an estimate, and I'll tell a bit more about the specific values you see, but the basic intuition is, so far, renewable hydrogen is more costly than fossil-based hydrogen with or without carbon capture. And yes, this is from early this year, the publication, summer this year, and natural gas prices have developed quite a lot. They are considerably higher than assumed in this diagram. So you need a bit of your own thinking to move the fossil-based hydrogen up there to get the idea that this is not totally accurate today. But the basic intuition, renewable hydrogen being more expensive, still holds. And so this shows the need for targeted policy support to actually support those no regret applications that really need hydrogen. And if we move to the next slide, the animation here, you can see that you have an horizontal line with an average green hydrogen cost. And then you see on the x-axis below the carbon pricing that we have assumed here. And we can see even at rather ambitious carbon pricing of 100 euros per ton of carbon dioxide, 200 euros of ton per carbon dioxide, you see that still this average renewable hydrogen is more expensive. And this is the understanding and the intuition that even a relatively high carbon price will not easily and not alone by itself incentivize the use of renewable hydrogen in certain applications. And that's the role for policy, because carbon pricing alone doesn't do the job. Now, this is kind of our background thinking on all of this. And then I'm getting closer to the German discussion. For Germany, we have delivered our own climate neutral Germany scenario, being climate neutral or becoming climate neutral by 2045. And if we go to the next slide, you get a picture for hydrogen on the left-hand side on hydrogen demand needed for Germany to become climate neutral according to our scenario. And already by 2030, you can see around 60 terawatt hours needed of hydrogen, clean hydrogen, to get on this pathway towards climate neutrality. And then later, 2045, you still see it a bit easier. There's about half of it needed for the electricity system, renewables back up in the electricity system together with district heating, so providing heat. And then the other part, the other half approximately, is industry and some road freight transport. So we need hydrogen to safeguard security of supply in the energy system and to create a climate neutral industry. That's the demand side for Germany. On the other hand, on the right-hand side, you see hydrogen generation. Hydrogen generation, this is pretty much consistent across many scenarios for Germany, will to about 2/3 be needed to take place somewhere else. Meaning the light blue shows what we can do domestically and the dark blue shows what we need to import to Germany. So that's a pretty strong message to the world that Germany will need to cooperate and will need to procure a lot of hydrogen from somewhere else. And in the footnote, you find the tiny detail that we'll need even some more hydrogen-derived molecules here called power to liquid. This is still considerably more to finally decarbonize the entire German energy system. Now, this is the background. Let's look at the German hydrogen strategy on the next slide. The German hydrogen strategy targets 5 gigawatts of domestic electrolysis by 2030. This is about half of what we have in our scenario, where we need 10 gigawatts of electrolysis in Germany installed by 2030. So the size we think of the German hydrogen strategy is not ambitious enough for now. There are policy support mechanisms, both for domestic projects and projects abroad. Just touching on some of the important keywords here. One is called carbon contracts for difference. It's particularly relevant for industry. And there are important projects of common European interest and the so-called German real laboratories. Think about the 10 megawatt, 50 megawatt, maybe approaching 100 megawatt scale of electrolyzers to be installed in Germany in a pretty kind of experimental fashion, new value chains, all of that going on in Germany with considerable volumes of policy support. There's one thing missing so far, kind of this, what I showed you earlier for the power system and renewables backup, the combined heat and power. There's something in the making, but so far this hasn't been implemented in Germany. And then in the next line, the projects abroad, you may have heard about, the next line, not the next slide. Please go back one slide. In the next line, you see projects abroad, which is H2 Global. You may have heard about this. This is about subsidizing, giving policy support to imports of hydrogen to Germany. And infrastructure development. This may be some kind of chicken and egg problem. Of course, you may ask, how do I get the hydrogen to the certain no regret applications that we see? And there is something going on in Germany, but we should be clear about the regulatory risk for gas transport system operators that try to convert and retrofit their natural gas networks for hydrogen use. There's a regulatory risk because this entire hydrogen development strongly depends on policies and policy support mechanism. And therefore, we wonder whether the current German hydrogen strategy pays sufficient attention to this problem of regulatory risk that the TSOs are facing here. So there could be probably more to be done here. And then final point, And this is not about the German hydrogen strategy per se. It's about the larger policy discussion around it. We will need renewable energy deployment for the overall climate neutrality objective. And this needs to increase considerably. If we just want to cover those around 25 terawatt hours of electricity to produce 19 terawatt hours of domestic hydrogen, we will need to scale up. And let me show you the last slide to make this more visual, and on the next slide, actually. Now, we need to increase the pace of renewable energy deployment in Germany. We need to double or to quadruple this. Is this feasible? Many people have asked this. If you look to the upper right part, there's a fine detail there in the fine prints, if you wish. And there are three numbers there. 10 gigawatts photovoltaics needed per year, about 2 gigawatt offshore wind to be installed per year, and 4.5 gigawatt onshore wind to be installed per year. This sounds like a lot, but in the best years of the past, and you can see that in the fine print, Germany has actually achieved this. So it is possible to have those supply chains to actually install all those renewables. That's what we need. To sum this up, what I've been trying to tell you is that we think a lot about this very focused, no regret hydrogen applications that truly need hydrogen to become climate neutral in the long run. And we should take precious taxpayers' money to actually support exactly those targeted applications, because carbon pricing alone, especially in the EU, will not do the job of incentivizing hydrogen deployment. And we need more for Germany than what has been foreseen for the hydrogen strategy. We need 10 gigawatts domestically, and then we need to work a little bit on our support instruments overall. But you can see there's a good direction, and this needs further refinement. And I'm looking forward to discussing that with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Matthias, for that, and also for your good timekeeping. If I may add one observation, the German policy process is not always known for its great speed. In this case, it has been very noticeable that the strategy that Matthias presents was adopted by the government last summer, and within 11 months, we have had already the commitments to the pilot program, which is around 8 billion euros of pilots across the supply chain. So the speed of action from Germany is, I think, also a really key message. Let's now turn to the European scale at EU level. And please, Dr. Mette, who is a research fellow at the Stockholm Environment Institute, I look forward very much to your presentation. The floor is yours.
Thanks a lot for having me in this important event. My pleasure to be here. So I'm going to try to give you an overview of some of the developments on hydrogen, sort of a policy and regulatory perspective in Europe. So if you can move to the next slide. And the next one, this is about SEI. So we are a Stockholm Environment Institute, another think tank based in Stockholm. And we have offices across the world in 7 continents with around, well, over 300 staff. And we work across all sustainability issues. So just a bit of a background, but now let's dive into the topic. So here's a picture. It's quite a familiar one, actually. I see many people use it in their presentations. Because it really shows you the scale at which projects are popping up globally. But what you can see from this visualization is that a lot of the projects that are sort of large scale are actually located in Europe. And there's a reason for that. So apart from the German hydrogen strategy, several European countries have also published their national hydrogen strategies. And also at the EU level, there is an emerging regulatory framework, a policy framework that creates an enabling framework for a hydrogen economy to nurture, let's say. So if we can move to the next slide. Yes, here, as I mentioned, and this list is probably already outdated because really one after the other, several countries are publishing their hydrogen strategies. In Sweden as well, there's one in the pipeline where I'm located, but you can see that, of course, Germany was one of the first countries to do that, spearheaded action in Europe, but France, Spain, Portugal, Poland, and Italy are among the other countries. that have announced their hydrogen strategies, and this is important because it sets the direction of the sector and gives predictability to businesses. But if we actually go a little bit deeper in the European architecture with the next slide, we can see that what has started this hydrogen movement in Europe is the hydrogen strategy. So the EU hydrogen strategy set up the let's say, the backbone of hydrogen policy of the EU. And this is actually not just a strategy, but it is an investment agenda as well. It has elements that are aimed at boosting research and innovation. There are elements in it that are focusing on demand and scaling up, which is much needed at the moment. And also elements that are focusing on associated infrastructure. And I'll give you some examples on how the strategy is actually currently being turned into action. And the hydrogen strategy also establishes a hydrogen alliance, and that's quite important because that replicates the battery alliance that we had also in Europe. So it's also focusing on non-state actor action. And the hydrogen strategy is not alone. It's not a standalone document, of course. It's part of EU's greater ambition to achieve emissions reductions by 2050, but also earlier as per the Fit for 55 package by 2030. And it's also, of course, part of the EU's Green Deal and recovery plan objectives. So it's quite embedded in both economic recovery, but also its climate targets. So you can see that the EU is giving a lot of emphasis on hydrogen as one of the pathways and energy carriers for deep decarbonization of the economy. So in the next slide, let's see what this hydrogen strategy sets as a trajectory. We can see that there are several targets, and I really, as a think tank, I really appreciate the staged approach. So we don't just set a 2050 vision, but there are some milestones to be achieved, and they are really quite ambitious in the EU framework. So within the next, let's say, 2 years, we're almost over with this year. There's an ambition to increase the capacity of hydrogen electrolyzers to 6 gigawatts. And we don't have to repeat that, but we know that hydrogen is used today in different sectors, especially in the industry, but this is all what we call the fossil-based hydrogen. So there's ambition to replace existing hydrogen production and initiate the markets and planning for the infrastructure. It's a journey, but the planning is to start by 2024. By 2030, we have a really increase in ambition from today's very minimum number of production of hydrogen. I think it's even below 1 gigawatts. I might be wrong, but I think that's the case, to almost 40 times more renewable hydrogen electrolyzer production. And as Matthias said, it's important to target the right applications of hydrogen use, where it makes the most business case, where it's most needed. So you can see that the hydrogen strategy of the EU also targets steel and transport sectors for the use of hydrogen. And there's also the creation of hydrogen valleys is also planned. Several European countries like Germany and Netherlands also have plans to create different industrial clusters to create a hydrogen ecosystem and also achieve economies of scale. And then, of course, the ambition goes higher up by 2050 to actually decarbonize, use hydrogen to scale up decarbonization of all hard-to-abate industries, what we now call easier to innovate, but this is steel, cement, these heavy industries. So if we can go to the next slide. So don't be scared. I don't have a lot of time, so I won't go through all that. But what I wanted to say is that it's not just a strategy, right? We also need to create the right policy, not regulatory environment. So there's now ongoing work as part of both Fit for 55, which has already started, but also across sort of all the, as part of the Green Deal, all the relevant legislative documents are being revised to enable hydrogen to be produced, traded, regarded, and certified. So there's, EU is connected by infrastructures, all this connecting Europe infrastructure, regulatory frameworks are being renewed, renewable electricity and renewable energy directives are being renewed, transport related directives are being reviewed, fuel related directives are being reviewed. So there's quite a bit of work going on at the moment in the EU to turn the hydrogen strategy into action. So in the next slide, it continues, so you have access to this. So I hope if you're interested, you can dive deeper. But there are also sort of the international dimension, as Matthias mentioned, that the EU has mentioned in the hydrogen strategy and is also acting currently to cooperate with the International Energy Agency, the Clean Energy Ministerial, G20, and several other networks to sort of create international standards, regulations, and definitions for hydrogen, which will really promote cooperation in this area, and it's really needed. Next slide, please. Again, I've mentioned already the Fit for 55, but just as an example, there's already, we can see that Renewable Energy Directive has set a new target for 2030 to have 50% share of renewable hydrogen consumption in industry. In the next slide, you can see that, as I mentioned, there are CO2 emission standards for cars and vans are also changing. So that is going to really also help create a market for hydrogen in Europe. So new cars, emissions from new cars now need to come down by 55% from 2030 and 100% from 2035. So it's quite a number. And if we can move to the next slide. It's moving a little slow for me. I think we can skip that, but I also included the UK hydrogen strategy to sort of, and we can move the slide, but in the meantime, I will just say that each European country, of course, choose their own path for sort of pursuing hydrogen economy. So in the UK, you have a twin track approach that wants to sort of support both blue hydrogen, natural gas-based hydrogen that is accompanied by carbon capture and storage, but also renewable-based hydrogen. Whereas in a country like Sweden, they are choosing renewable hydrogen as the only sort of viable pathway. But that doesn't really stop cooperation across European countries. That's one note I wanted to share. And we can move to the next slide in my last minute, actually. Just wanted to say that green hydrogen is also quite important from the economic perspective, as I mentioned in the beginning. And we can see that there are quite a lot of opportunities for creating sustainable jobs. And also, I would say that this is also a good opportunity for gender diversity because we're sort of creating a new sector. And to do that, in the next slide, I will conclude that we have set up Women in Green Hydrogen. It's a network that is aiming to sort of give visibility to women in hydrogen sector, but we have grown in numbers and also in ambition. So now we have also monitoring program, not monitoring, mentoring program, and a lot of content discussions. So if there are women interested in hydrogen, even if you're not in this sector, please connect with us. You can find us on LinkedIn. So I'll just stop here.
Thank you very much. That was an excellent overview. So if I may, I think we have two key headlines from the European German context. One is really quite detailed policy and investment plans already in the 2020s. And the other is this is driven both by climate targets and by an agenda of economic opportunities, particularly that very important reference to the economic recovery plans in Europe. Let's now turn to ASEAN and Southeast Asia and take a perspective on some of the strategies developing here. So, excuse me. I heard the sound was difficult for a moment. So to look at hydrogen in ASEAN, economic perspectives, developments and applications, Benny Suyadi is the manager in power generation and fossil fuel and alternative energy and energy storage department. That's a big department at the ASEAN Center for Energy. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jesse. And hello, everyone. Warm greeting from Jakarta. I'm really excited to join with you all in this important discussion. My highest appreciation for Agora for inviting me to represent the ASEAN Center for Energy, sharing the insight on the hydrogen development in the Southeast Asia region. So it's not a wave yet, but it's coming. So I'm going to speak from the perspective of our recent study, the hydrogen in ASEAN, economic prospect, development and application that was released several months ago, and some reaction to the German and European perspective. Next slide, please. So energy demand in this region has soared in the recent years in tandem with its rapid economic development, modernization, and population growth. According to the 6th ASEAN Energy Outlook, our flagship study that was released last year, in many model scenarios, fossil fuels will continue to dominate the energy mix in the region in the future. However, the 10 governments of the ASEAN member states are nonetheless hoping to transition to the highest share of renewable energy in their energy mix. By 2025, they are planning to have a 23% share of renewable energy in the energy mix and 35% share of renewable in installed capacity through deploying large-scale renewable energy, accommodating a higher share of renewable energy in the ASEAN power grid, increasing renewable energy investment, and exploring new and emerging energy technologies such as hydrogen. In the recent year, there has been a significant development in hydrogen energy, both technology and supply chain aspect in the region. As the potential role of hydrogen to serve as an energy storage for intermittent renewable energy generation, especially from the solar and wind energy, become clearer, it's become increasingly attractive to the government in this region, trying to transition toward the use of higher share of more environmental sustainable form of energy. The potential to reduce the greenhouse gas emission in transportation sector is also very exciting. Next slide, please. So given the opportunity of hydrogen technology to support the green energy development in the future, so we conducted the study entitled the Hydrogen in ASEAN, Economic Prospect, Development Application. The study was presented at the recent ASEAN Minister on Energy meeting as a part of key strategies under the ASEAN Plan of Action for Energy Cooperation, our regional blueprint on energy cooperation. The result of this study indicate that the ASEAN region has the resource to produce green, blue, and gray hydrogen. So expected that the production and transportation cost of hydrogen technology will decrease in the near future and become competitive with other energy sources. The study found that the gray hydrogen production in Brunei Darussalam, Indonesia could already today compete with other energy sources. I will share more about the finding from this study. This is also related with the key message from the previous presentation on the perspective on the hydrogen study in German by Dr. Matthias and also in Europe by Dr. Guggenheim. However, in case you want to learn more, please feel free to visit the website and download the report. Next slide, please. ASEAN has indigenous energy resource to produce green, blue, and gray hydrogen. However, at the current level of capex required for hydrogen production and transportation technology, and also considering the relative high LCOE of the renewable energy in the region, so it's not yet economic to use the hydrogen energy in either power sector or the transport sectors of the countries immediately. Next slide, please. In view of the expected decrease of the capex for both hydrogen production and transportation, but we also recognize the formation of the energy market storage overseas, such as in China, Japan, and South Korea. Hydrogen produced in the region and supplied to this overseas market could become competitive as vis-a-vis fossil fuels in those markets. Next slide, please. So again, we found that the gray hydrogen, based on the calculation that we have in these studies, the countries like Brunei Darussalam and Indonesia, it somehow could be considered as already could be competitive in the current situation. In the futures, as the cost of hydrogen storage and transportation fall, we expected that way gray hydrogen production could be upgraded to the blue hydrogen production coupled with the carbon capture storage, while still maintaining a competitive level of supply cost to the overseas markets. Next slide, please. The key takeaway, I think this is similar to what is happening in Germany and Europe, even though we do not have a detailed strategies yet. The application of hydrogen for electricity storage and transportation is still not economically competitive in this region. However, the gray hydrogen produced from the countries of Brunei and Indonesia could already be competitive for export market. This may be a question to many on why we're exporting this kind of hydrogen instead of using it for regional aspiration toward the energy transition. Next slide, that's moving forward. We also trying to ride the wave of hydrogen. So we are pursuing development of regional policy roadmap and strategy in the stepwise basis. So we are looking at the pace that we aim to pursue until 2030s. So it's evident for us that policy have a substantial direct impact on competitive of the hydrogen energy. This is also what being highlighted by the previous two speakers. Dedicated policies such as tax, subsidies, and other incentive or disincentive for the energy market and for vehicle ownership. Okay. And you said that for the hydrogen could be equally as important as the progress in technology and supply chain in order to bridge the cost gaps as quantified in our studies. Hydrogen has been produced and delivered most for the energy use at the demonstration scale. This implies that on the one hand, the economic of scale and learning effect have not shown the power to reduce the cost of hydrogen supply. And on the other hand, the infrastructure for the transportation and delivery of the hydrogen at large scale for energy use has not been established. So in this regard, also a similar message with the previous speaker that a supportive policy framework with a long-term plan and target is critical to reduce the uncertainty faced by the stakeholders in the investment of the hydrogen-related infrastructures. Finally, general energy and environmental policy that favor clean and green energy could help improve competitiveness of hydrogen and thereby bridge the gaps. This includes the market mechanisms such as the competitive electricity market and pricing of the power grid auxiliary service and pricing storage service. This can be additional stream of the revenue to hydrogen supply chain. An innovative financing instrument will help enable investment in hydrogen infrastructures and reduce the financial cost will also play the important role in this regard. So I'm ending my presentation here and happy to have a follow-up discussion. Thank you, Jason.
Thank you very much. So not a wave yet, but it is coming. Now, if hydrogen is to come on the wave, of course, it will be very important that in addition to those of us who are policy observers who've spoken so far, that companies are making these investments. So I'm very pleased to turn to Kenneth Kong, who is a Senior Vice President, Group Strategy and Portfolio from Sembcorp, who also provided that very nice video at the start of our webinar. Please, what is the potential for hydrogen applications in Southeast Asian markets seen from your perspective today? The floor is yours.
Thank you, Jesse, and thank you to Agora Wind for inviting me to have share some thoughts this evening on the application of hydrogen. My presentation essentially covers two things. One is in response to the title, Hydrogen Wave, and why there are differences I see in ASEAN versus the European community and its adoption of hydrogen. The second part is around how my company, Sembcorp, and our country, Singapore, is approaching the application of hydrogen as a decarbonization pathway. So let me first turn to the very intriguing title. Next slide, please. I don't see the development of hydrogen in ASEAN as so much as surfing a wave at the moment, but actually exploring rock pools for potential resource opportunities. And let me try and explain why. Next slide, please. If you look at an image of a wave, surfing a wave basically suggests that you're being driven powerfully, singularly, in one direction. And in this case, supported by integrated supply chains and consistent policy frameworks. But herein lies the first difference between Europe and ASEAN. Europe has a much more holistic approach towards your broader sustainable development goals, and also greater harmonization across policy frameworks than arguably we have in ASEAN. I listened with interest to Mr. Benny Suryadi's presentation around the ASEAN's development of a cohesive regional policy, but I would say that we are not quite there yet, certainly not at the level of integration that the Europeans have showed. And I think this translates into, if you look at a map of existing hydrogen projects, the European Union, and you can see the map on the bottom left, has a lot more projects in the pipeline than some of the startup smaller attempts in Southeast Asia, although I think we'll hear more about those in the coming country-based presentations. Next slide, please. The approach I've taken is to try and share that there are differences across the entire supply chain, starting up with downstream, or the demand side of the equation, which is very effectively, whilst demand for power and energy in Europe has more or less stabilized, in ASEAN, it continues to grow aggressively, notwithstanding the sort of dampener that COVID-19 has put on our economies, but it is recovering now. So you have a challenge in ASEAN of trying to meet growing demand for energy whilst at the same time trying to decarbonize. Now, if we go to the upstream slide, please. In the upstream, again, you can see that ASEAN has traditionally relied on hydroelectric power as part of its renewables. And only recently have we seen a material increase in wind and onshore wind particularly, and solar in markets like Thailand and Vietnam, helped no doubt by the rapidly declining capex costs and fits and subsidies. But if you look at the chart on the top, Europe has had much more time to develop its renewable resource base. And it is off that base, that large set of infrastructure, that you can then start to develop your green or at least decarbonize hydrogen prospects. Next slide, please. Now, I talked about the downstream and the midstream, the upstream. The bridge that connects both the supply and the demand side of the equation is the midstream. And in the case of Europe, you can see from the map on the left that they have a much more interconnected system of grid and gas supply than ASEAN. We are not helped by our archipelagic geography, particularly in Indonesia, where many of the power grids are basically based around the islands, and they don't cut across. Even in land-connected countries like Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore, we don't see that much interconnection or interdependency of the countries for mutual provision of power. Okay. So last slide on the key differences, please. Finally, I just want to touch on technology. Europe has had a much longer gestation period for the development of renewables than ASEAN, right? You can see that now your renewables growth basically has continued to grow and across both wind, solar, bioenergy, and resources like that. Whereas in ASEAN, there is still a great reliance on coal and natural gas and hydroelectricity, and in some countries even geothermal. So the familiarity and the development of the renewables industry in ASEAN is still very much in its nascent stage, whereas the Europeans are now very much focusing, I see, on how you decarbonize and how the renewable sector plays such an important role in that. So now, those are the key differences, and which is why I sort of say that Europe can surf a wave that's already there, whereas ASEAN countries are still looking around their neighborhood and trying to explore the various rock pools of available lower carbon energy. Now I'm going to go to very quickly on to Singapore and Sembcorp. Next slide, please. In the case of Singapore, you must understand that we are very, very poor in the sense of domestic renewable resources. So although we are very committed to decarbonizing our economy, much of our solution must come from imported forms of decarbonized energy. And this transition is going to be a very lumpy experience for us. So to reflect on what Dr. Matthias said earlier, we need to basically prioritize whatever decarbonized energy that comes into the country to the best application of that energy to decarbonize. So you can see we have a large power sector. We also have marine and ground transport users, and we also have industrial chemical feedstock users, all of which in some way or form can be decarbonized using hydrogen. But we need to be very selective on how we do it. Next slide, please. So Singapore's decarbonization strategy is based on 4 switches. The continued use of natural gas as a cleaner option versus what we used to use in terms of coal. We are trying to maximize our production of domestic solar power. And in fact, Sembcorp is one of the largest solar power producers in Singapore. But you might laugh when I tell you how many megawatts that constitutes rather than gigawatts. We're also trying to explore regional power imports through regional grids. And finally, the 4th switch, which is where hydrogen is cited, is basically exploration of low carbon alternatives. My simple point here is that a energy resource poor country like Singapore has to basically be very careful in how it selects its imported energy, simply because we cannot afford for any of these ones to fail. We need the supply resilience and security. So we are also exploring our local rock pools. Next slide, please. Sembcorp is a major player in all of these 4 energy switches. Natural gas, we are the country's largest natural gas importer. We combust that natural gas to produce power. We are also the largest domestic solar player, and our recent floating solar farm is actually one of the world's largest floating solar farms at 60 megawatts. We are also trying hard to integrate and import energy from Indonesia. We signed an agreement with Indonesia just this week, actually, at SU, to develop up to 1 gigawatt of imported solar power. And finally, we're also exploring low carbon alternatives with the recent signing of an MOU with Chiyoda and Mitsubishi to develop an end-to-end integrated supply chain. So I'll move to the last slide now. This is just an example of how Sembcorp, being a company, as opposed to, say, a policy think tank or a government agency, we are actually trying to commercialize a real supply chain that attempts to bring decarbonized hydrogen, you can see from the upstream side on the left side of the slide, to import the lowest cost, most reliable, secure supply of decarbonized hydrogen into Singapore and match that with the highest value sectors in the downstream on the far right. The role that we play as a corporation together with our partners is to stitch up this entire supply chain, so we try to address the classic chicken and egg problem that has dogged many, many attempts to commercialize hydrogen in the past. So I will leave my presentation at that. Jesse, I hope I've stuck with my with the 10 minutes that I've got. And my last observation is that, it seems that surf's up for hydrogen. So the question for Southeast Asia is that, are you willing to take the plunge? Thank you.
Thank you very much for that excellent presentation. So, to all the panelists, I think there is one clear question that links what you have said. And that is, we are talking about creating complex supply chains. As Kenneth says, we will have a certain element of the traditional chicken and egg question. What that means is the importance of a framework. A framework, first of all, set by policies that give a direction of change aligned with climate targets, but also give a set of regulatory arrangements that are suitable. A framework that allows the supply, the delivery, and the demand sectors all to be confident that this hydrogen wave is coming, and to be confident, therefore, that the other parts of the supply chain will also decide to surf the wave. Because of that, because of the importance of having a framework that enables lots of confidence, who needs to be included in the discussion about policies? We have reference to people who have a climate perspective on policy, people who have an economic opportunity perspective on policy. We have think tanks contributing to this discussion, obviously we have a very important role for many different companies. And there has been, of course, also a reference to jobs and indeed to the Women in Green Hydrogen network. So there are many potential stakeholders to this. In addition, we have very important regional actors, ASEAN notably. Who are the crucial actors to be included in this discussion about policy frameworks that can enable the wave to be surfable by all the different actors? I know that's a very broad question, but I think it really is the next one we face as we go from strategies and corporate internal plans to massive implementation. Would one of the speakers like to pick up that question first? Hello, at the moment I see only the main, hello, I now see Benny. And all the speakers, excellent, that's better. Okay. So, Kenneth, I think it was very clear from you that the chicken and egg challenge is part of the perspective of a corporate looking at this. What would you like to see from policymakers, not just in Singapore, but at the ASEAN region level? And what do you think might be interesting lessons from the policymaking that we've had presented from Europe and Germany? Meanwhile, I'm turning to our three policy panelists and asking them to think about what is the most important element of the policy framework from your perspective that can enable these supply chains in this wave.
Thanks, Jesse. If I may start off as both an end user and a supplier of the hydrogen, because a company like ours actually uses hydrogen as well as tries to supply it to the end customer. Now, I think what we can learn from the European experience is that there's a lot of cross-border cooperation and policy harmonization, and even things like standardization of what is considered green hydrogen, right? Those things are important. In Singapore, our lesson here so far is, as I said, we have less of an integrated approach amongst the family of ASEAN countries. So from a practical point of view, what Singapore has done is, whilst it puts in policy frameworks locally, nationally, to support the adoption of hydrogen, they have also reached out to have G2G conversations with the Japanese and the Australians to see how both sides can work together. Because whether Singapore likes it or not, it has to import decarbonized hydrogen. It cannot produce enough locally. So therefore, it is compelled to look outside and make friends, basically, overseas. And to the extent that the policy framework encourages that, it gives us, corporations like Sembcorp, some confidence to go and try and create the supply chain, because we know we have the backings of not just our own government, but the actual upstream governments and the other major downstream governments like the Japanese, who are also technology providers, right? So I guess my answer to your question is we have a lot to learn from Europe in how they integrate together, but Singapore is not necessarily waiting for that, that sort of paradigm to appear, because we are under pressure to decarbonize, and therefore we will work with anybody who can help us establish the supply chain.
Okay, thank you. I think Benny would like to come in. Matthias, I think the question about friends overseas also has big implications for the German case. Benny, please.
Right. Thank you. I echo what Mr. Kenneth mentioned. Again, from our studies, that the policy have a very important role in driving so-called wave, or in our report saying is direct impact on the competitive level of hydrogen. The issue that we have in ASEAN, like we are in the phase from the fossil fuels into the renewable energy. So currently, we are in the moment that private sectors, many stakeholders, starting to see the government having a serious commitment policy on renewable energy. So this is something is not happening in the past 10 years, but the last 2 years is quite a solid commitment from the countries. One of the fact is last year alone, ASEAN cumulatively installed 22 gigawatt of new installed power capacity, and 82% of that was renewable energy. So this is a new, notably new trend for ASEAN, and it also come as a commitment from the government. So we are on that pace, renewable energy, the solar and wind, while hydrogen is somehow that it's still, maybe the terminology from Mr. Keller is much better in reflecting this kind of thing. So what we have today is, like we have Indonesia, we have Brunei on the G2G approach with Japan, which is also mostly driven on the Japan side instead of the country's push on this hydrogen development. So it's a bit, that's why we look in the stepwise approach that maybe in the next 10 years that only ASEAN will be able to coming on as a regional approach. For the ASEAN power grid, it takes 2 decades, 3 decades for us to come in really on board. We just have the grid development for the last couple of years, including what Mr. Kenneth mentioned with the signing of the interconnection between Indonesia part and Singapore. So it's been still quite a while, but so this is what we also playing as the ACE, as the regional actors in driving the energy transition. We work with all the energy ministry in 10 countries and also with the utilities and the companies to address this issue. Thank you.
So let's take this G2G perspective and the need for friends overseas. Am I correct to perceive that in the European context, and I look at my 2 European colleagues, that there is both cooperative planning and a little bit of competition also between different countries to see who can be at the front of the wave? Matthias, you have your hand up.
Yeah, sorry, I was going to add at least one thought on what Kenneth was saying, which I think is at the core of many discussions, because he was asking what is green hydrogen relating to standardization internationally. And let me just add one more thought to make it a bit even more complex, because what is green hydrogen is the first answer to what may qualify to be funded and subsidized with policy support from governments. That may be the first step. And now if we add a layer of complexity is in the long run, those are supposed to be kind of more private markets with less governmental intervention. And if that's what we're longing for, then in the end, we're talking about end products that need to show that they have become a bit greener by using green hydrogen. Now, this final step means we need to convey this information from what constitutes green hydrogen further to final end products. To give one very prominent example, green steel making. If we want to sell green steel to people and then that people buy cars made of partly green steel at least, we need to hand over this piece of information. And this then relates back to standards of, if you wish, more encompassing carbon footprinting, labeling, if you want to sell your greener product with a green premium on private markets. And this is kind of the whole complexity and the beauty of starting with green electrons, green molecules, finally handing it through to green final products in order to get those markets going, just to add that.
Sorry, thank you. So I think we're going to end with the women in green hydrogen in our discussion. Do you have a thought on both this question of government-to-government collaboration and also, in particular, whether standards are an important part of that, as Matthias is suggesting? And you mentioned some of this in your presentation, but I know there's a lot of depth behind that. Please.
Yeah, sure. I mean, government-to-government cooperation is, of course, quite important, and there are quite a lot of platforms for that. So what we have now in Europe is, especially on technology cooperation, we have the Mission Innovation platform, where companies and also governments engage on hydrogen at the sort of innovation level. So this is one example. IRENA also brings together different governments for that. and in a way, but also at the same time, there's of course risk of sort of duplication of this cooperation efforts. Hydrogen architecture, or let's say landscape, is really becoming quite crowded. Each company, each association have their own sort of program, so that can pose a risk in sort of creating an understanding of what's at stake. But I think, certainly for sort of trade and being able to see where hydrogen makes the most sense, it's going to be quite important, especially in Europe, where when we look at sort of industrial clusters, they are really in certain locations. Some of them are close to borders with other countries, so cooperation will be important because not all of these clusters are also right next to sort of energy producing regions. So when you said what needs to happen, and I always say that we need to sort of focus on where hydrogen makes the most commercial sense, because we're not going to have a lot of hydrogen. So for me, heavy industry is definitely one sort of sector where we know that we can really reduce emissions, where we know that there's a market, there's a demand, it's large demand, perhaps before going to sort of home applications and so on. So that's sort of my take on hydrogen. And then you said about standards, absolutely, and we need to speak the same language. And there are some initiatives, I believe, I think among associations, like the German association, DENA is speaking to Smart Energy in Australia to have a common certification scheme. We definitely need to have a sort of, let's say, comprehensive definition, because at the end of the day, yes, hydrogen is hydrogen, but we need to look at embodied carbon content of hydrogen to be able to speak of terms, like not colors, but really embodied carbon should be the language. So I'll just stop there.
Thank you. Well, we have some questions coming in from the audience who clearly really enjoyed this panel. The first question is, of course, getting to the heart of this, which is the costs of the renewable, the green hydrogen. And I agree fully that the colours are actually not a great basis for setting formal descriptive standards, but they are quite a good shorthand for when we're saying essentially that we're talking about the hydrogen that will come from the electricity system and the electricity system that will be renewables based. On the costs of renewable hydrogen, the question is, look, this is more expensive in Europe compared to the alternatives today. So what is it that's fundamentally driving the government decision to support the green hydrogen route in Germany, in Sweden? Why not the blue-green mix that the UK has gone for? And whether the reasons for this are useful reasons to be thought about in Southeast Asia. Go ahead, please, Matthias.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I mean, particularly from the German perspective, Germany has for some years now had relatively high ambitions when it comes to reaching what's now being called climate neutrality or net zero. In the past, Germany was talking about minus 95% greenhouse gases, but today it's now moving to minus 100%. And with that perspective, looking at the kind of this final stage, looking at technologies that finally will not be able to deliver by themselves doesn't seem a good choice. And what we know as blue carbon or blue hydrogen, or fossil-based hydrogen with carbon capture, technically, when you listen to some of the technology actors in the community, they say, yes, we can reach something like 98% capture. Okay, so that at least doesn't really qualify for minus 100% in the long run. So the question then moves rather to what about the time before? An interim time, a decade or two, that's then probably a more precise question, because in the long run, this doesn't work unless you provide some other form of negative emissions to compensate the remaining 2% that you can't really capture, plus any possible fugitive emissions upstream that you cannot really avoid. Those two components, fugitive emissions and non-captured carbon, are both important to understand that for a finally climate neutral or net zero system, those technologies don't qualify. But for the interim period, that's, I think, where kind of the juice of this discussion is about cost mainly, and then about how long will blue be competitive compared to green, assuming green gets cheaper, what's the investment window really for going to blue? Because there are not many states in Europe having CCS infrastructure today. So it's not an easy jump into blue. Yeah. It's a solution where we have assumptions about cost. And actually, the first person or a company still has to demonstrate a 98% capture rate, which we just don't have. So it's easy to say, let's do a 75% capture rate. We can retrofit SMR, but demonstrating the high ambition needed for getting very close to climate neutrality, it's a challenge. Plus the low fugitive emissions. So both things are difficult to organize, and it's both a race against time and for showing that the technology is there and works at the assumed cost.
Mm-hmm. Certainly, Matthias, in that analysis, the renewable-based green hydrogen sounds more based on current technologies and experience, frankly, than the blue hydrogen discourse. Turning to the Swedish example, because Sweden also has taken a strong position on this, what would we learn from Sweden about the decision to focus green?
Of course, I'm not an official representative of the Swedish government, but what I can say is that I think I fully agree with what Matthias has said, but at the same time, I think the other side of the coin is do you have enough renewable energy capacity? So in Sweden, we're blessed with hydro. There are also, there's still nuclear in the mix. So there's no shortage of renewable energy, so that they would now go for gas, which they import anyway, and then switch to renewable. So it just makes much more business case. And also in Sweden, we have quite a good and functioning carbon price. So that's why it's one of the reasons why I think Swedish sort of, let's say, businesses are all aligned, because there's the belief is that in the long run, it makes more sense. It's more profitable to be net zero compatible today, and then for cost savings in the future. So that's, I think, the rationale in here.
Now, that's an interesting two statements there, because in principle, many countries have many renewable energy opportunities. I realize that Singapore, in its particular situation as a city-state, is a special case. But much of Southeast Asia is in a different situation if you look across the range of renewable energy potential. And of course, every country has the opportunity to consider a price on carbon. So in principle, those two conditions are available to most places in the world. One of the interesting things I have heard said in the hydrogen debate over the last 2 years is that there is actually very little specific energy asset advantage to one country over another country in terms of hydrogen. It's not as geopolitical as the fossil fuels have been. Right. And this meets a very, very different kind of G2G type dialogue and opportunity. It also creates a situation where certainly some countries that are renewables rich are thinking about first mover advantage. Because if in principle, many countries can become suppliers also for export markets, there is a reason to wish to be at the front of that process with the infrastructure, with the commercial relationships. In that context, we will be turning now in panel 2 to look at 3 countries in Southeast Asia, where, yes, the hydrogen wave has not yet arrived, but many of these preconditions that we've been discussing really are now very, very hot topics. The hot topic of the shift in the electricity system from coal to renewables, the hot topic of the question of whether natural gas, particularly natural gas from global markets, is a choice those countries wish to make. The hot topic, of course, of where energy demand will grow and ensuring that there is the supply and the infrastructure in growing economies with growing populations, and a very important agenda to deliver affordable energy access. And countries that have, of course, also got their own climate target processes and are looking at targets, plans towards targets, and then ultimately policy instruments towards targets. So part two of our webinar today. The hydrogen outlook in Southeast Asia. Now, here we're turning to a more long-term perspective than the 2020s. And this brings in fellow think tanks, great friends of Agora Energiewende from around the world. In particular, we will have a speaker from IESR in Indonesia. We will have a speaker from Viet in Vietnam, and a speaker from Thailand's National Energy Technology Center. I think we're going to turn first to the Indonesian case. So may I welcome my colleague Fabi Tumiwa to speak from IESR and to speak about India's deep decarbonization plan to 2050, a report, in fact, done jointly with Agora Energiewende, and how hydrogen fits into that deep decarbonization 2050 perspective. Fabi, are you ready with us?
Yes, thank you, Jessie.
Thank you.
Yes, ladies and gentlemen, as Jessie mentioned, we have published a report on deep decarbonizations, Indonesia Deep Decarbonization 2050, and we also look at the potential role of hydrogen in this decarbonization effort. This study has been published in May this year, and it can be found and easily to download from our website. Next, please. In this study, we look at how Indonesia and energy system can deliver energy efficiently, affordably, and sustainably, meeting the Paris Agreement target, which is we look at the potential of transformation energy system to meet the 1.5 degrees target and look at the emission from the energy sectors. And in this study, we run 3 scenarios. We look at current policy scenario and delay policies scenario and the best policy scenario. Under the best policy scenario, we concluded that the deep decarbonization with 100% renewable energy supply in 2050 is technically feasible and financially viable. And we can see that the rapid increasing of renewable energy capacity from right now around 40% in 2020, and it become 100% in 2050. So it replaced the fossil fuels. Next. Electricity generations, we look here is that it's one of the, we look at the 3 sectors, so power sectors, transport, and industry. And electricity generation is actually, we look is a bit faster compared to the other 2 sectors. And in this scenario, a solar PV emerged as the primary source of electricity generation. We look at around more than 89% in the best policy scenario. As we know that the solar PV is also intermittent, therefore the battery emerged as major technology, but we also look at the compositions of the contribution of hydropower and geothermal share. So it's because of the limitations of geothermal resources, we see that the optimal use of both geothermal and hydropower is still possible, but then a PV gives you the best result. And coal-based generation declines through the transition in the next 30 years. And the share of electricity based on industrial heating increased significantly from 2030 to about 50% by 2050. Next. Sorry. Synthetic fuel conversion technology, including direct air captures, play a vital role in providing energy for application where direct electrification is not possible, and the hard to abate sectors such as marine, aviation, and industrial processes. We know that the technology evolve right now, but this is with this model, we look at what the technology that available currently in the market. And in here, the synthetic fuel conversion provide flexibility to the energy system via power to fuel integration. Also, greater capacities provide higher flexibility enabled by, we look at the electrolyzer, but also it's add to the overall energy demand. Installations of across all three scenarios, as I mentioned before, with the most installed capacities increase significantly, as you can see in this chart, beyond 2040. And with a major share of water electrolysis, along with CO2 direct air capture, as a basis of Fischer-Tropsch and hydrogen production up to 2050. So we can see here that actually as electrolyzer become competitive and renewable energy capacity increase, you see that after 2035, there is a rapid increasing of hydrogen productions also. And electricity input for the Fischer-Tropsch fuel productions, it's almost 187 terawatt hour, yeah, by 2050. Next. So we, in the best scenario, hydrogen plays a higher role, and also we need like storage infrastructures. We can see that storage infrastructure increase significantly by 2050. And in this, the synthetic fuel conversion technology, that's as a main, a major share of water electrolysis. And we see that after 2035, it is increasing. And in this model, we look at also installed CO2 direct air capture increase significantly from 2035 onward, with over 40 million ton CO2 annually installed by, in 2050. Next. So that's the model. So in the last 2 years, we see that in Indonesia, interest in hydrogen production is emerging, but actually policy and regulatory support is still limited. According to the Pertamina, oil and gas company that currently also produce hydrogen from oil and gas field, domestic market potential is actually up to 2.5 million ton per day, and around 40 billion annually. That's the size of the market domestically. And we also see that a number of plans to build a combined renewable and hydrogen power plant, so power to X. And one plan I understand is expected to commercially operated in 2024. It is small, but I think it is the plan is quite solid. And our oil and gas company, Pertamina, is planned to produce green hydrogen. Right now, they are doing a study from electricity from geothermal. The plan is start with 100 kilogram per day in 2022 from around 300 kilowatt of geothermal power. Yeah, that's but they plan to increase further. Also, few coal companies explore to produce brown hydrogen from coal. Some are looking at potential to include CCS with these productions. Also, a number of company has shown interest to produce blue hydrogen from natural gas with CCUS technology, and we also look at the interest for ammonia productions. I think in Indonesia case, in terms of hydrogen, is not only for energy, but as we are one of the largest fertilizer producer in the region, so ammonias, that's a very vital, I think is also a feedstock for fertilizer industry is very, very important. So replace that, the one that from natural gas or fossil fuels with hydrogens from natural gas with CCUS it's seen as feasible options. Next. So what would be the right approach for Indonesia? This is from our perspective that we need, as the market already move and they explore the possibilities for hydrogen production. Now is very, very basic and it's just beginning, but it potentially could be very high. So we need like more integrated planning and policy approach, and also to overcome barriers, in particular green hydrogen production. So it's we have to emphasis for this green hydrogen productions, and I think it's still policymakers need to be educated a lot and to make integrated planning and policy approach, something like that. Next, I think that's the last. So it says Indonesia is very, very new in this, but I believe that we will see in the next 3 years hydrogen will be emerging, and as the technology and as the renewable energy penetration increase, I think the green hydrogen could be faster than we thought. Thank you.
Fabi, thank you very much for that. And thank you for importantly mentioning the fertilizer sector, also the role of the oil and gas sector, who are certainly becoming very interested in geothermal. And it's very interesting to hear of that example of using geothermal with an objective to produce green hydrogen. I also noticed that in the scenarios you present, the more ambitious scenarios have more hydrogen. So from the perspective of future-proofing, I think you are right that there will be a growing interest in this in Indonesia in the next very few years. So please, now let's turn to the case of Vietnam and Nguyen Nho, who will speak about also a very early stage debate that we have now in Vietnam. But Vietnam is one of the countries that certainly has significant potential, both for onshore and offshore wind and for solar energy, and therefore potential to produce green hydrogen. Nguyen, are you ready with your slides?
Yep, thank you.
Perfect, thank you.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me to participate in this event. My name is Nguyen. I'm working as the Executive Director for Vietnam Initiative for Energy Transition. So I'm happy to share the view from the independent think tank on the perspectives of long-term hydrogen development in Vietnam. So next slide, please. Yes, so we can see that my presentation would have two parts. The first would be I will talk about the Vietnam energy sector and the way for hydrogen in Vietnam. So in this graph, we can see that in the last 10 years, we Vietnam, the total final energy consumption increasing 4.3% per year, and most depend on oil, coal, and electricity. And the end user consumption can be seen mainly serving for the transport, industries, and household consumption. Next slide, please. This graph, we present the future of Vietnam power capacity mix as the latest draft PDP-8 in September 2021 in base case. And the table is so that in the next 10 years, the power source expansion would be mainly from fossil fuel. Renewable energy development like wind and solar is posted later in 2030 to 2045 periods. Next slide, please. So we see that Vietnam have a very good potential on the solar energy with the irradiation around 3 to 5 kilowatt hour per square meter. And we also can see that in the next slide is the development of the solar energy. Can you turn to the next slide? Yeah, it's already developed 16 gigawatt in that 8.6 gigawatt solar farm and 7.7 rooftop solar. Most of the projects are located in the south and center of Vietnam, and where is very less demand side in the center of Vietnam. Next slide, please. So we see that this is the potential of the green energy, and with the potential on the onshore wind would be 42 gigawatt, and offshore wind with the fixed foundation could be 261 gigawatt, and floating offshore wind about 214 gigawatt. And in the area of the south and some part in the north of Vietnam, where you can see the red color, then it is a very high potential for the wind energy development. Next slide, please. So we see the development of the green energy start from 2012 with 30 megawatt and expected to be 5.8 gigawatt in the end of this year. We also can see the support from the government side when they change the feed-in tariff, and it's I think the wind energy are really booming in Vietnam. Start 2018, we see a lot of the construction and new wind energy project going on in Vietnam, and we hope that it can be continue carry on to develop the wind energy. So in the next slide, then you will see the study from our organization on the offshore wind scenario. And we see that Vietnam could have a potential to develop 10.2 gigawatt in the next 10 years under zone 4, 3, and 1. And we have been proposed that Vietnam can develop offshore wind to electricity, but also for the green hydrogen. And we see it's the big potential for Vietnam to start with offshore wind and combine together to develop the logistics service and green hydrogen. Next slide, please. So you can see the Vietnam logistics industry seeing the significant growth due to the country expanding economics and manufacturing, and the aviation, maritime, and road networks carry a bulk of the freight and contributing to the industry growth, and of course the ASEAN market as well. So provide green hydrogen when given new opportunities and having open for the technical innovation to improve the logistical efficiency and reduce the emission of the energy. It also can back up for the renewable energy as well. So yeah, in the next slide, you also can see this map is to show the Vietnam have a resource of the oil and gas, but we think blue hydrogen will be not everything as the green hydrogen for Vietnam, given the fact that Vietnam not yet have any hydrogen project. However, a think tank on the energy transition from Vietnam, then we believe the new chance for the energy transition will be from oil and gas to hydrogen for the transport sector. And however, at the moment, we can see the lack of the infrastructure, for example, like for the transport and storage, as well as the cost of the production, especially for the green hydrogen, is not yet profitable. But we think it could be like once the market is booming, then it could be like the price is going to be going down. So we are doing some research on the apartment emission scenarios for the energy sector in Vietnam, and we consider the hydrogen could be an option for Vietnam after 2035, and it could need to have a policy support in the first step, but we will become a future business for the new energy. So we think it's very potential for Vietnam to develop the hydrogen, green hydrogen, and we think the logistics industry need to go together with the development of the green hydrogen in the future. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. As I was listening to you, I was thinking, of course, the existing fossil fuel energies that we have, they all had policy support and they all had infrastructure master plans as they were developed. So we should not be surprised also that the renewables, the hydrogen, the renewables with the green hydrogen would also need this. And certainly there is a huge potential from what you have presented in Vietnam. Okay, we have another presentation. We're now going to turn to perspectives from Thailand. So Dr. Sumitra Charokun is the Energy Innovation Research Group Director at the National Energy Technology Center. And please tell us about the perspective seen from Thailand on possibilities for hydrogen and how these will facilitate the energy transition overall. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Right. Good evening, good afternoon, everyone. I would like to share the slides. Actually, this one is coming from the committee meeting of the Hydrogen Thailand Club just in September this year. So for this presentation, I would like to represent Hydrogen Thailand Club. But you can also ask me later about the research and development. Okay, so this one, we have formed the Hydrogen Thailand Club for over 2 years now. And key players, key participants in this hydrogen club include the Ministry of Energy, PTT Group, Toyota, BIG, Electricity Generating Authority of Thailand, Mitsui K-Line, Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, and Banpu, as well as Entech, NASDAQ, where I belong. So actually, it consists of several parts from government, from private sectors, and from users. Next slide, please. So the structure of our Hydrogen Thailand Club consists of the chairman, secretariat committee, and we have advisory, in which the advisory board, they are the top executive of the listed members. And we divided into 3 working groups, working on strategic and policy affairs, working on technical affairs, and also public relations affairs. And we have 4 main areas of interest. For example, mobility and infrastructure, industrial heat and power, energy storage, and also transportation of hydrogen itself. So we try to divide our members into these working groups and also the areas of interest, trying to push forward into the policy. Next slide, please. From the beginning, the CTO of PTT Group, Mr. Witawat, he was the chairman of our club. But recently, from the 22nd of September this year, the chairman has been appointed to the executive of BIG, Mr. Piyabut. So right now, but the team from PTT still support the club as well as the BIG team. Next slide, please. So the vision of our Hydrogen Thailand Club is to drive hydrogen as a future energy platform for the decarbonized circular economy in Thailand. For the mission, we have to create the collaboration. We try to initiate demonstration project, and also we want to create public and government awareness for the hydrogen applications. So we have several actions, and we try to publicize our activities and to reach out to new members. So actually we have new members joining nearly every month right now. Next slide, please. And for the official plan of the hydrogen policy in Thailand, right now is under study so that it will be included in the National Energy Plan, which will be released next year. So we try to look at the overseas case studies, for example, for the California, to see and whether we can adopt some of the overview from that to our Thailand market and situation. And also we look at the California net zero target and then how the fuel cell electric vehicle can play a part in this plan, and also for the better understanding of the support from the local governments in California for the use of the FCEV. And also I would like to talk a little bit about the National Energy Plan. That is a step forward for the Thailand for the hydrogen economy, that we have to look at the infrastructure for the production, for the storage, and also for the transportation of hydrogen. And then how to increase the demand and supply of hydrogen itself. And also we have to look at the safety guidelines for the production, for the storage, and also transportation of hydrogen. And then the policy guideline for the hydrogen producing and utilization. Next slide, please. We have set the net zero target already for the country. So, and also we have launched the policy for the zero emission vehicle in the next 14 years. So we try to reduce the amount of the CO2 as much as possible, but it has to be economically viable as well. And right now, the majority of the CO2 emission actually coming from on the left-hand side, 42% coming from the public electricity and also for the heat production. So this is the main target that we have to tackle. So hydrogen is regarded as a pathway for the net zero, that fuel cell electric vehicle can reduce the use of the gasoline and also diesel. And it can also be used for many industries on top of the existing usage in refineries or steel industry. So it can be used as the chemical energy storage as well. So it is good in a way that it will reduce the CO2 emission, and also it will create more of the energy security, but it has to be economically competitive. Next slide, please. So the target that for mobility, hydrogen to be applied for mainly for the long-range driving car, which is backed by several reasons for them, such as economics or user experience aspect. But at the same time, the battery electric vehicle is aimed for the mainly passenger car. So we try to forecast the growth of the Thailand fuel cell electric vehicle from the year 2030 onward to 2050. that the forecast will show very positive effect, that it will be growing a lot, as you can see, that from the kiloton CO2 per year from 273 up to 25,000. This is for the CO2 saving, for example, that we hope that the fuel cell bus and truck in combination will add up to about 28.5%. Next slide, please. Anyway, we need support from every sector. And right now, the government has some study, undergoing the study, and then we'll try to plan for the step forward. But for the Hydrogen Thailand potential support, we try to create the experience through the demonstration project. And also we do the connection with the overseas partners in terms of the hydrogen economy adoption, in terms of policy, in terms of technology, and also regulations. And also for the greenhouse gas emission and LCA determination, and also analysis. And also for the technical support in the hydrogen technology throughout hydrogen value chain. This is what we have to look at. Next slide, please. And for the demonstration project that we have planned for the fuel cell electric vehicle, this one is in collaboration between the PTT group with the BIG, which is the hydrogen supplier, and also with Toyota. So the objective of this demonstration is to encourage the hydrogen usage in Thailand under the ZEV policy, to increase the public and government awareness, and to promote the hydrogen in the national energy plan, and also to demonstrate the hydrogen for transportation in both the electric vehicle itself and also in terms of the station, to comply with the regulation and standard. And this demonstration project can pave the way for the future fuel cell business. That for this project, we plan to use 2 Toyota Mirai, and the target group is to serve in the tourism industry in the Eastern Corridor, which is around the Pattaya area in Chonburi. The routing is on-demand routing, but the maximum distance is about 850 kilometers per trip per full tank. So hopefully we try to commission this in the next 2 years for this project. So it's undergoing under the careful plan for this one. And next slide, please. Okay, this one I would like to show the symposium that we organized last year in October. So on the left-hand side, this is all the executive involved in the advisory of the Hydrogen Thailand Club, with some exhibitions at the bottom. Okay, I think this is it from the Hydrogen Thailand Club. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Sumitra. So I heard two particularly interesting elements there. One was the importance of the Hydrogen Thailand multi-stakeholder committee. That sounds a little bit like some of the things that we have seen also in Europe. We have a Wasserstoffrat, a hydrogen council in Germany. And also the importance of some of the demonstration, or at least small pilot projects. That brings me to a big question for all three countries. What is the kind of evidence that, in addition to the evidence you have presented today, would help to support the political policy dialogue, bringing together of the different stakeholders on the hydrogen opportunity and the hydrogen timetable in your countries? What kind of additional evidence would be most helpful? In Vietnam, we've seen a lot about the renewables resource. In Indonesia, we've mentioned that a very important oil and gas operator is beginning to show interest. In Thailand, you have had a stakeholder process. What extra would you like to see happen in the next 2 or 3 years to strengthen the understanding and strengthen the focus? Any one of you, nobody wants to go first, of course, with this question.
Well, I can start. I think Indonesia is very unique. I think unlike with the others, as I mentioned, the role of hydrogen is also becoming important, not just as energy carrier, but also as a feedstock for the fertilizers. So here, I think the questions is, let's say, if the market, we know that how much natural gas is required to produce the fertilizer, right? So the questions is, I think in the near futures is whether ammonia from hydrogens really can replace this natural gas as a feedstock for the fertilizers, right? So the economics is very, very important. Now, I think if we would like to make sure that the productions of ammonia coming from green hydrogen, not brown or green, then the cost of the green hydrogen should be very competitive, right? Compared to hydrogen right now from oil and gas, or later on from a coal. Right? And Indonesia is also rich with coal, so it's very interesting. And I think the key here is that how rapid renewable energy can be deployed in Indonesia, because that could bring the cost down. And also given the previous presentations, as mentioned in case in Europe, like see the role of carbon pricing is also very important to make this hydrogen become competitive, right? And I think we have just seen that in Southeast Asia, the carbon pricing has just emerged. In Indonesia, last month, the new laws on has indicated for the implementations of carbon tax. So we will see how this kind of policies will help the competitiveness of green hydrogen. And we would like to see this, how the technology plays. And in particular, I think, again, the rapid deployment of renewables will be game changer for this hydrogen in Indonesia.
May I ask one question following up on the fertilizers? I was in another hydrogen debate recently, there are many, and one of the participants represented at international level the fertilizer sector in one of their business trade associations. And she said very interestingly, she said, when it becomes a situation in which our relationship with the shipping industry is very, very important, and perhaps, in fact, our business models will start to have more and more in common as we start to think about the energy for shipping, we start to think about moving hydrogen in the form of ammonia. She could see a convergence. Has the shipping industry in Indonesia been engaging, to your knowledge, on the energy transition debate, or do you think they're having their own separate discussion about hydrogen at the moment?
Well, I think that's one of the discussion right now in Indonesia, so much focus on the production side, not the transporting nor the infrastructures. I think, as I mentioned, this issue has just emerged and also driven by the decision of the government to decarbonize Indonesia energy system 2060 or sooner, and then that decision has just arrived in May this year. So we can see that the discussions, all the plan regarding hydrogens is pretty new. I think it will take some time until then it reach, for instance, the shipping industries, and also the plan to integrate infrastructures for hydrogen transportations or storage.
Okay, thank you. So let us turn to Thailand and Vietnam. What would be the evidence that would really help for the next stage? Perhaps Thailand first, then. Sumitra.
Right. Okay. I think that what we have nowadays is a result of the Paris Agreement mainly. So I think if the COP26, which will be held at the end, well, in a few days' time, this might help a lot to shape the policy, maybe to force some kind of forcing some governments to have some policy. But again, the underlying is the economic though, whether it's going to be competitive with the existing or not. So without any policy guidelines or for the global policy like the decarbonization, then it's very difficult to compete just one by one like that.
Mm-hmm. Well, in fact, in the audience chat, there are questions coming up about the affordability, also the socioeconomic opportunities around the energy transition. Now, this is much broader than hydrogen, as we understand. Hydrogen is one element of that debate about economics and opportunity and the affordable transition pathway. But as we know, one key element for being affordable and also for building up skills that will enable to support jobs is good forward planning. If we have a sort of shock transition, that will be very, very disruptive. If we have a well-envisaged, well-roadmapped transition, it will be certainly cheaper and certainly socially much, much more compatible. In that context, then, I am looking at the case of Vietnam. You really have two questions you could address in our remaining moments as we pick up questions with the audience. One would be this about next evidence in Vietnam, but I know also there's a lot of interest in the affordability topic. So if you want to go there, I'm sure members of the panel would like to speak about that.
Thank you. So I think for the evidence, I would say that in Vietnam, there's a program under the GIZ management, and that program is kind of support for the government in Vietnam to have a more evidence that the hydrogen could work. And there will be some kind of transfer technology and capacity building, not just only for the policymaker to understand more about the transition of the energy shift from the oil and gas to the hydrogen. And Vietnam as the seaside countries, so we always expect that the logistics business could be developed together with the development of the new energy. So I could see that on the one hand, transfer technology, capacity building for the people and for the industry sector to understand more about the new energy and also about the new business. If Vietnam becomes the hub to provide the hydrogen from the offshore wind, then it could be the very good chance for Vietnam, not just about the energy for the energy sector, but it's also good for the future of the logistics service. I think this is the main interest from the Vietnam government at the moment, and we see this is a new opportunity for Vietnam during the energy transition period of time. Yeah.
You very sensibly bring in, of course, the macroeconomic perspective. The energy sector is there to serve other sectors of the economy. And if the energy transition is successful, that will enable the success of other sectors, which are very profitable, which employ many people, which can be very important to a country's economic opportunities and its relationship with its region and with the world. I've had one specific question come in about the transport sector, which has been mentioned in the context of cars. And the question really is, to what extent do we see hydrogen fuel cells playing a role in the passenger car sector now? This, of course, was mentioned by Sumitra in Thailand, but particularly in sort of the next segments of road transport, vans, lorries, short distance, long distance, light load, heavy load. This is a spectrum. Matthias mentioned this topic right at the beginning of our webinar today. And I think different countries are taking different perspectives on where the transition is from purely electric to the fuel cell model. Anybody like to comment on that in the case of these three countries or Southeast Asia more generally?
Yeah, I think that for the fuel cell and battery, they have been competing for the past 20 years or so already, or more than that. But I mean, in the beginning, about 20 or 30 years ago, fuel cells seemed to be doing well at that time with a lot of the prototypes launching at that time. But later on, just about 10 or 15 years ago, that the battery just took the lead. But still, this is not the end yet, because the fuel cell has the advantage of the longer range. But for the battery, it is probably better for the city or in the urban areas. So they can coexist though in the same community, but have different purposes. For the longer range, then we should go for the fuel cell. But for the shorter range, then we can definitely use the battery electric vehicle. So I think this is what many countries are going forward with this scenario.
Abby, did you have a thought on that? I have visited all the cities that the three of you are sitting in, and I'm thinking of the enormous number of vehicles on the street and the traffic, also the pollution associated with that. Do you see the possibility that also the transport discussion and the importance of solutions and opportunities in transport can help drive a discussion about hydrogen in your countries? Is raising the transport question going to help address also the energy transition answer?
In Indonesia, I think right now there are very limited discussions on the fuel cell hydrogen car. And we also know from the technology perspective and also from the industry perspective, well, although the government policies on electric vehicle, for instance, not single out the fuel cell hydrogen, but we know now if you look at the current existing technologies and the investment trend in Indonesia, most of this the new car manufacturers actually invest in battery electric vehicle, not fuel cell hydrogens. I think if we look at the also limited player on this field, I think there's only few. And also we look at the countries, look at the California, I think it's quite advanced with the fuel cell hydrogen vehicle. Even there is still an issue in terms of limited infrastructure, because we know for hydrogen fuels, I think building hydrogen fuel network is more complicated than building battery electric charging station, which is also the cost of infrastructure developments is even higher, I think, compared to battery electric vehicles. And we look at the number of scenario indicated that it will take years until hydrogen fuel cells actually can compete, right? So I think right now we still see the technology emerging, and battery electric vehicle also is still infant in the country like Indonesia. So it means that we will see maybe in the near future the situation can change. But if you look at the current situations, I think from industry and investment perspective, so far for personal transportations is actually electric vehicle dominate the space.
Okay, thank you. I have a strict eye on the clock also, because of course we are participating in this very big Singapore International Energy Week event. So we are under strict instructions to end on time. In light of that, I think I have to wrap up our discussion now. Thank you to all of our presenters. Thank you to our audience. I think this has been a really very interesting discussion at a very interesting moment in time. I do hear the message that many of the climate policy announcements, but also the processes looking at energy, are really still very new in the countries, in the region. And there's a lot of work that could change over the next 6 months, the next year. So I hope we'll be able to reconvene this discussion with some additional learnings, some additional insights, perhaps even next year, certainly within the next 2 or 3 years, and have a really strongly updated picture of planning, pilot projects, corporate interest, stakeholder processes, policy frameworks, and really all the elements that will bring implementation so that that wave does actually reach the beach. Thank you very much again. Thank you to the audience, and also a big thank you to the technical staff in the background for this very, very smooth event and the very professional experience of working with you. I wish everybody a good night, a good evening, a good afternoon around the world. Bye-bye for now.
Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.